understanding the differences in a multicultural team is a huge study in itself. So in this video, I will do no more than introduce you to perhaps some of the most common of the many types of difference that we find in cross-cultural teams. Not so that you can become expert in it, but so that you can simply recognise these differences, be aware of them, and take them into account in the way that you react to colleagues that come from different cultures. We can think of cross-cultural differences as being different ends of a number of different scales. And each culture has a kind of average position on each scale. And I say an average position because, of course, within any culture, individuals are individuals, and some will be at one end of the spectrum and others at the other end of the spectrum. But most of them will cluster within this kind of average amorphous range within the spectrum, and that therefore becomes characteristic of their individual culture. But of course there are many different spectra based on the very many different dimensions of organisational, social and human life. So let's look at 10 of the common ranges within which different cultures fall. The first is around the way that we like to communicate. And the extremes of this are often referred to as low context and high context. High context communication is often very subtle. It's indirect. It makes assumptions that we have a large shared understanding of the context, and therefore we don't need to be so precise. Low context communication tends to be a lot more direct, a lot more on point and precise. Next is a preference for organisations to be either highly hierarchical or highly egalitarian. At the hierarchical end, people have a huge expectation of deference. Status is very important. At the egalitarian end, people tend to want a democratic way of making decisions and to feel that everybody is in their place based on merit. Next, we have a range of approaches to social situations, which we might describe as at one extreme independent and at the other extreme interdependent. People from cultures at the independent end tend to separate issues from personalities, whereas at the interdependent end of the spectrum, cultures tend to value harmonious relationships. Dignity is important, and so is saving of face. The issue itself is tied up to the relationship. Also in the social sphere is a preference for behaviours that range from competitive to cooperative. People and cultures with preferences at the competitive end tend to be very comfortable with conflict where they perceive it to be necessary and appropriate. At the cooperative end, you'll tend to see a lot more consensus seeking. Rather than wanting an argument, we want to find something that we can all agree on. My fifth spectrum is also social in nature, and it ranges from individualistic to group-oriented. At the individualistic end of the spectrum, we tend to find a focus on your own needs and your own personal fulfillment. Whereas at the group-oriented end of the spectrum, we find behaviours that are designed for the group to succeed. People put the needs of the group, the needs of the many, above their individual preferences and desires. Now we're halfway through, I just want to interject to say that if you're thinking that you can see the advantages in one end of the spectrum over the advantages of the other end of the spectrum, or maybe the advantages of this end over that end, then that's entirely natural, because there is a good chance that your culture does not sit bang slap in the middle of every single spectrum. If you can see the advantages of both ends of the spectrum, even though you may have a personal preference at some point in the spectrum then you're on your way to multicultural sensitivity. Anyway, back to the next 5. Attitudes to time mark a significant difference among many cultures. This might range from what we might call loose time to tight time. And this is about the extent to which you respect the clock. At the loose time end, cultures tend to be very relaxed about meeting deadlines. Are they deadlines, or are they just an indication? And also very responsive to changes. Whereas at the tight time end of the spectrum, we have a lot more concern with meeting deadlines, being on time, and sticking to the plan. Individuals will often range from being assertive on one end of the spectrum to private on the other. That is, willing to state what they need, or very much keeping themselves to themselves and worried and less keen to put themselves forward. However, we also find that cultures tend to range on the same spectrum as well. And although within one culture you'll find a lot of variation, there's certainly going to be a centre of gravity that differs from culture to culture. Next is the spectrum from merit to standing. At the merit end, cultures tend to expect reward to be based on earned recognition. Whereas at the standing end of the spectrum, we find cultures who expect status relate to things like history, labels, symbols, family. At number 9, I've got a spectrum ranging from expressive to controlled. Again, there's a lot of variation among individuals within any one culture. However, at the expressive end, we find cultures and people who are keen to show their emotional response to situations, whereas at the controlled end of the spectrum, we find a suppression of emotions and a highly rational response to everything. And finally, my last spectrum ranges from pragmatic at one end to submissive at the other. People who are from cultures towards the pragmatic end of the spectrum value choice. They value their own agency and their ability to take control over their own lives, whereas at the submissive end of the spectrum, they are more happy to find their choices in the control of others, or indeed of destiny or fate. I've seen many lists of spectra like the ones I've illustrated. Some have as many as 12 or even more spectra in them, and not all of the lists are the same, so adding them all together, I'd be prepared to expect 20 or more meaningfully different spectra. But I've chosen 10 that from my experience are important in the workplace, either because the differences they express are common or because they are of substance in the workplace, in that they affect the way that people make choices and get on with their work, and therefore, if we don't understand the nature of these spectra, they can cause conflict. Your job as a member of a multicultural team, and in particular as a leader of a multicultural team, is to recognise that these differences exist and to respect the differences and to put them to good use. Make people feel welcome in the team because their differences add to the quality of the team's decision making, the robustness of the solutions that it finds, and the joy of working together with a wide range of interesting colleagues. Please do give a thumbs up if you like this video. There's loads more great management courses content to come, so please do subscribe to our channel and do hit the bell if you don't want to miss any of it. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, keep learning.